Atlas heard the past before Caleb Rowe ever opened his eyes. At 4:17 in the morning, the house at the edge of Pine Hollow Road sat under a thin veil of Tennessee fog, quiet except for the slow ticking of the kitchen clock and the soft hum of the old refrigerator. Outside, the porch boards were silver with dew. The mailbox leaned slightly toward the gravel drive. A flag, faded by too many summers, hung still beside the front door. Then came a sound so small most men would have slept through it. Metal touched wood. Once, light as a coin dropped into a church offering plate. Atlas lifted his head from the rug beside Caleb's bed. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not growl. His amber eyes opened with a kind of knowing that did not belong to an ordinary morning. Down the hall, Caleb slept in a faded gray t-shirt, one arm resting over the blanket, his face turned toward the window where the fog pressed pale against the glass. He was 37, broad-shouldered, white-skinned, and worn in the quiet way of men who had come home from service but never fully returned from it. A scar near his left eyebrow caught the dim light whenever he shifted in his sleep. On the nightstand sat a half-empty glass of water, a pocket knife, and a small wooden box he had not opened in 3 years. Atlas stood slowly. His paws made no sound on the floorboards as he moved through the hallway. At the front door, he stopped. His nose worked the air. Rainwater, road dust, a stranger's coat, and beneath it all, something older. Brass, sweat, field soap, memory. Through the narrow window beside the door, Atlas saw a shape moving away from the porch. A person in a dark jacket, head lowered, walking toward a vehicle parked without headlights near the bend. No face, no voice. Just the brief red blink of taillights swallowed by fog. Atlas nudged the door handle, then looked down. On the top step lay a dog tag, dull and scratched, its chain coiled like a sleeping snake. The metal turned once in the morning air, catching a thin blade of moonlight. Atlas pushed the door with his shoulder. It had not latched all the way. Cold air slipped in. The dog stepped onto the porch, lowered his muzzle, and touched the tag. The moment his nose met the metal, his body went still. Not fear. Recognition. He picked it up carefully between his teeth and turned back inside. Caleb stirred when the bedroom door creaked. "Atlas?" he murmured, voice rough with sleep. The dog crossed the room and climbed his front paws onto the mattress, placing the cold dog tag against Caleb's chest. Caleb's eyes opened. For 1 second, he did not understand. Then the metal slid into his palm, and the name pressed against his skin like a prayer returning from the dark. Caleb did not move at first. The dog tag lay in his palm, cold enough to feel as if it had been waiting outside all night, though some instinct told him it had arrived only minutes ago. Atlas stood beside the bed, ears high, chest still, watching him with those steady amber eyes that never wasted fear. Caleb sat up slowly. The room around him returned piece by piece. The pale curtains, the boots by the dresser, the folded work shirt on the chair. The framed photograph turned slightly toward the wall because some mornings were easier when the past did not look back. He rubbed his thumb over the scratched metal until the name became clear beneath the grime. Elias Ward. The air left Caleb's lungs in a quiet, broken breath. For 3 years, that name had lived in places he avoided. Official letters, sealed reports, late-night silence. The space between sleep and waking when memory came too close. Elias had been more than a man in Caleb's unit. He had been the one who made coffee too strong, sang off-key on long drives, and wrote letters to his little brother on the backs of supply forms because he said real paper made promises feel heavier. Caleb had not spoken his name aloud in months. Atlas nudged his wrist, not gently, but with purpose. Caleb looked down. "Where did this come from, boy?" Atlas turned his head toward the hallway. Caleb swung his feet to the floor. The boards were cold beneath him. He pulled on jeans, a flannel shirt, and his old field jacket, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had trained himself never to hurry unless the moment truly demanded it. Outside, the fog had thickened over Pine Hollow Road, settling low between the trees and along the fence line. Caleb stepped onto the porch with Atlas at his side. A single wet footprint marked the top step. Not large, not small, just clear enough to prove someone had stood there. Caleb scanned the yard, the gravel drive, the mailbox, the dark stretch of road leading toward town. Nothing moved. No engine sound. No neighbor's porch light. Only the smell of wet grass and cedar. Atlas lowered his nose to the boards, followed the scent to the edge of the steps, then froze facing north. Caleb knew that posture. He had seen it years ago when Atlas was younger, before Gray touched the fur around his muzzle, back when the dog could read a room faster than any person inside it. It was not panic. It was a signal. Caleb followed his gaze toward the tree line beyond the shed, where an old service road disappeared into the woods. He had not walked that way in years. There was no reason to. That road led toward the closed rail crossing, the abandoned storage buildings, and beyond them the hills where cell service faded to nothing. Caleb turned the dog tag over. On the back, mud filled the grooves of something etched by hand. He tried to wipe it clean with his sleeve, but Atlas stepped forward, whining once, low and urgent. Then the German shepherd did something that made Caleb's heart tighten. He left Caleb's side, trotted straight into the house, and returned with one of Caleb's boots in his mouth. He dropped it on the porch, then looked north again. Caleb stared at him. "No," he whispered, though the word had no strength. Atlas picked up the boot and dropped it closer to his feet. The fog moved through the trees like breath. Caleb looked at the dog tag, then at the road, then at the loyal animal standing before him as if carrying orders from a place no living voice could reach. Somewhere in that quiet morning, the life Caleb had built after the Marines began to loosen at the seams. He bent down, tied his boots, and Atlas finally wagged his tail once, not with joy, but with relief. Caleb kept the porch light off as he stepped into the yard, not because he feared the dark, but because some truths showed themselves better when the world stayed quiet. Atlas moved ahead of him through the wet grass, nose low, paws steady, following a trail Caleb could not see. The eastern sky had begun to pale behind the trees, turning the fog from black to silver. Pine Hollow Road curved empty in both directions. A mile away, a rooster called from the old Miller farm, thin and lonely in the damp morning air. Caleb slipped the dog tag into his jacket pocket, but the weight of it seemed to settle much deeper, somewhere behind his ribs. He followed Atlas past the shed, past the woodpile, past the broken bird bath he had promised himself he would fix last spring. Normal things. Safe things. Things a man chose when he wanted a life without alarms. But Atlas did not pause for any of them. He reached the back fence and stopped at the gate that led toward the old service road. Caleb had chained it shut years ago after buying the property, telling himself it was to keep out trespassers. The truth was simpler. He did not like where it led. Atlas sat in front of the gate and looked back. Caleb breathed out slowly. "You remember this place?" The dog's ears twitched. Caleb took the small key from a nail inside the shed and unlocked the chain. The gate opened with a low metal groan that felt too loud in the morning stillness. Beyond it, the service road ran north between thick pines and red clay ditches, its gravel half swallowed by weeds. Caleb had walked that road only once, the week he moved in, and even then he had turned back before reaching the rail crossing. There had been no reason to keep going. Or maybe there had been too many. Atlas stepped forward, then stopped again, waiting. Caleb followed. For the first quarter mile, neither of them made a sound. The fog hung low enough to wet Caleb's eyelashes. His boots sank into soft patches of earth. Somewhere in the trees, water dripped from branches in slow, patient taps. Atlas moved with the focus of a working dog, not wandering, not sniffing at rabbits, not chasing the morning sounds. He was tracking something older than scent. At a bend in the road, he suddenly cut left toward a fallen cedar. Caleb called his name once, but Atlas was already pawing at the ground beside the roots. The dog scraped away damp leaves, then lowered his muzzle and pulled out a strip of faded green canvas. Caleb crouched beside him. The fabric was weathered, stiff with dirt, but the stitching along one edge made Caleb's fingers go cold. It matched the lining of an old Marine field pack. Not a replica, not something from a surplus store. He knew because Elias had repaired that pack himself with crooked stitches during a rainy week in Virginia, laughing that it would outlive them all. Caleb held the canvas in both hands. A memory rose so clearly it nearly stole the road from beneath him. Elias sitting on an ammo crate, threading a needle with exaggerated care, saying, "Ro, if I ever disappear, just follow the bad sewing." Caleb closed his eyes. Atlas pressed his shoulder against Caleb's knee, grounding him without a sound. The dog tag in his pocket seemed to pulse with the same impossible message. Caleb opened his eyes and looked farther up the road. The fog was thinning now, revealing the outline of the old rail crossing ahead. The warning lights had been dead for years. The tracks were rusted. Beyond them, the hills lifted dark and quiet. Atlas picked up the strip of canvas, carried it a few steps, then dropped it at Caleb's feet like a second clue. Caleb understood then that whoever had left the tag had not chosen his porch by accident. They had known the house. They had known the road. Maybe they had known Atlas would remember what Caleb had tried so hard to forget. He stood, wiped the dirt from his hands, and whispered the name he had avoided for too long. Elias. Atlas looked up at him. Then, from somewhere beyond the tracks, a branch snapped under a careful foot. Atlas heard it first, though Caleb felt it in his chest a heartbeat later. The branch snapped beyond the rusted rail crossing, sharp enough to cut through the damp morning. Then everything went still again. Not empty still. Waiting still. Caleb reached down and touched the fur between Atlas's shoulders, not to hold him back, but to remind them both that they were together. The German shepherd stood rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed on the gray veil between the trees. He did not charge. He did not bark. He watched like an old soldier at a doorway no one else could see. Caleb slipped the faded canvas into his jacket beside the dog tag and took one careful step toward the tracks. "Who is there?" he called, his voice low but steady. The fog shifted. A figure appeared on the far side of the crossing, half hidden beneath the sagging arms of the old signal post. It was the same person from the porch, or close enough for Caleb's bones to know it before his mind did. Dark jacket, cap pulled low, hands open at his sides. Not threatening, not peaceful either, just weighed down by the kind of message that could ruin a man's sleep. Atlas let out a low sound, not anger, not fear, more like recognition wrapped in warning. The stranger looked at the dog first, then at Caleb. "You still have him," he said. His voice was quiet, roughened by cold air and years of unsaid things. Caleb's fingers tightened at his side. "You left this at my house." He pulled out the dog tag, but did not step closer. The stranger swallowed. In the growing light, Caleb could see he was younger than he had expected, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes and a face that looked as though it had carried another man's grief for too long. "I had to know if you would follow," the stranger said. Caleb stared at him. "You could have knocked." A sad smile flickered and vanished. "I did not know if you would open the door." The words landed harder than they should have. Behind them, a crow called from the pines, and the sound rolled over the abandoned tracks like an old question. Atlas moved forward 2 steps, then stopped at the edge of the rails. The stranger lowered his gaze toward him. "He looks older." Caleb said nothing. Atlas remembered the scent. The stranger continued. That was the only part one was sure of. Caleb's breath slowed. "Who are you?" The man reached into his coat slowly, using 2 fingers, careful as if speaking to the dog as much as to Caleb. He pulled out a folded photograph and placed it on the wooden crossing beam between them. Then he stepped back. Caleb waited. Atlas sniffed the air, gave no alarm, and Caleb moved close enough to pick it up. The photograph was faded at the edges, bent down the middle, but the faces were clear. Caleb saw himself first, younger, standing under a hard Virginia sun with dust on his uniform and a rare smile on his face. Beside him stood Elias Ward, arms slung around Caleb's shoulder, grinning like the world owed him nothing because he had already forgiven it. On Elias's other side stood a boy of about 16, lanky, pale, nervous, trying to smile with the courage of someone visiting heroes. Caleb looked up slowly. The stranger had removed his cap. The same eyes, the same stubborn set of the mouth. Older now, but unmistakable. "My name is Jonah Ward," he said. "Elias was my brother." Caleb felt the morning tilt beneath him. For a moment, he was no longer on Pine Hollow Road. He was in a memory of diesel fumes, hot pavement, and Elias laughing as he introduced his kid brother during family day. Caleb had shaken Jonah's hand and told him his brother was the best man in the unit. Elias had pretended not to hear, but his smile had betrayed him. Now that boy stood across from Caleb with fog on his shoulders and a secret in his hands. Caleb looked down at the dog tag. "Why now?" Jonah's eyes moved toward the northern hills. "Because someone sent me the rest of what Elias left behind." Caleb went cold in a way the morning could not explain. Jonah pointed past the tracks, not dramatically, not like a man starting trouble, but like someone finally placing a burden where it belonged. "There is a cabin about 2 miles up that service road." He marked it before everything disappeared from the record. Atlas stepped onto the first rail, then looked back at Caleb. His tail was still. His eyes were clear. Caleb knew that look. It was the same look from the porch. The same message. Keep going. Caleb did not answer right away. The old service road climbed beyond the tracks in a narrow ribbon of red clay and broken gravel, disappearing between pines that stood close together like witnesses unwilling to speak. Jonah Ward waited on the far side of the crossing, hands visible, shoulders tense beneath his dark jacket. Atlas crossed first. He stepped over the rusted rail with slow certainty, then paused and looked back. Caleb followed because some part of him already knew the truth would not come to his porch twice. The three of them walked north with the fog thinning around their boots. No one spoke for the first half-mile. The morning opened slowly, turning the wet leaves bronze and the spiderwebs silver. Birds began calling from high branches, but the sound felt distant, softened by the trees. Atlas led at an even pace, nose low, stopping only when the trail split near a dry creek bed. Jonah pointed left. That way, he said. Caleb glanced at him. You have been there? Jonah shook his head. Not all the way. I found the marker, then turned back. Why? Jonah looked toward Atlas. Because I did not think it was meant for me. Caleb wanted to question that. He wanted to ask how a grown man could follow clues for years and stop 2 miles from an answer. But then he remembered all the sealed boxes in his own house. All the mornings he had walked past the old service gate and called it peace. Sometimes turning back was not weakness. Sometimes it was the only way a wounded heart kept beating. Atlas suddenly stopped beside a pine with a split trunk. He lifted one paw, holding still. Caleb saw it then, carved low into the bark, nearly swallowed by moss. 3 short lines in a half circle. A unit mark. Not official. Not recorded. Something Elias had drawn once on a napkin during a long delay at a roadside diner, joking that every lost soul needed a sign home. Caleb touched the carving with 2 fingers. The bark was rough and damp. The mark had weathered years of rain, but it was still there. Jonah spoke quietly behind him. There are 2 more. Atlas moved before Caleb could ask where. The trail narrowed, climbing over roots and stone. After another 20 minutes, the second mark appeared on a flat rock near the creek, and the third on the rotting post of an old hunting fence. Each one pulled Caleb deeper into a past he had tried to leave in rooms with locked doors. The cabin appeared just before the sun broke clear of the hills. It sat in a small clearing, gray boards bowed with age, porch sagging, windows clouded with dust. Vines crawled up one side. A wind chime made from bottle caps hung silent near the door. Nothing about it looked important, and maybe that was why it had survived. Atlas approached the steps and lowered his head. This time he did growl, but softly, not at the cabin, at the weight of what waited inside. Caleb climbed the porch. Jonah stayed back near the tree line, his face pale in the morning light. You should open it, he said. Caleb tried the door. It resisted, then gave with a tired wooden sigh. The inside smelled of dry leaves, old paper, and cold ash. Dust floated in a beam of sunlight that slipped through a crack in the wall. There was a table, 2 chairs, a rusted lantern, and nothing else until Atlas walked to the far corner and began pawing at a loose floorboard. Caleb knelt. His hands shook as he pried it up. Beneath it was a metal ammunition box, wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the years as if someone had believed with all his heart that it would be found. Caleb lifted it out and set it on the floor. Jonah stepped into the doorway, but did not cross the threshold. Atlas sat beside Caleb, close enough that his shoulder touched Caleb's arm. The latch opened with a small click. Inside lay a cassette recorder, a stack of photographs, a second dog tag, and an envelope marked in Elias Ward's handwriting. Caleb stared at those crooked letters until the cabin blurred. He knew that hand. He knew the impatient slant, the uneven pressure, the way the capital are always leaned too far right. On the envelope were 4 words. For Caleb, when ready. Caleb closed his eyes. Atlas leaned into him. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt the past waiting not to punish him, but to be heard. Caleb did not open the envelope first. He could not. The 4 words on the front seemed too gentle for what his hands were feeling, and gentleness was sometimes harder to face than grief. He reached instead for the cassette recorder, its plastic case scratched, its buttons stiff with age. Jonah stood just inside the doorway now, one hand resting against the frame as if the cabin might shift beneath him. Atlas remained pressed close to Caleb's side, quiet and warm, his breathing steady in the hush. Caleb turned the recorder over and found a strip of tape across the back, yellowed but still holding. Written on it in the same crooked hand was a date Caleb knew by heart. The last day before everything changed. He pressed play. At first, there was only static, thin and crackling, like rain against a faraway window. Then came Elias Ward's voice. Older than memory. Weaker than Caleb wanted it to be. But alive in the room. Row. The recording began, followed by a soft breath and what might have been a tired laugh. If you are hearing this, that means the bad sewing worked. Caleb bowed his head. A sound left him, not a sob, not quite a laugh, but something caught between the two. Jonah covered his mouth with his hand. Atlas lifted his ears at the voice, then looked toward the empty corner as if expecting the man to step from the dust. The tape continued. Elias spoke slowly, sometimes pausing long enough for the machine to hiss in the gaps. He said he had made it farther than the reports ever claimed. He said there had been confusion, broken communication, and decisions made by people who cared more about clean paperwork than the truth. He did not accuse Caleb. Not once. Instead, he said Caleb had done what he was trained to do. He said Caleb had tried. He said the last thing he remembered clearly was Atlas refusing to leave a closed gate until someone pulled him away. Caleb looked down at the German shepherd. Atlas was older now, silver at the muzzle, but his eyes had not changed. Elias's voice softened. Tell that dog he knew. He always knew. The recorder clicked faintly as the tape turned. Outside, a breeze moved the bottle cap chime, and for the first time it gave a small, uneven note. Elias went on, explaining that he had hidden copies of what he found, enough to reopen questions that had been buried too neatly. Names, dates, coordinates. A report marked final before it should have been. Nothing dramatic in the way he said it. No anger rising. Just a man placing truth into the hands of a friend because truth deserved better than a locked drawer. Then the voice changed. It grew quieter, almost tender. Ro, listen to me. You did not leave me. I need you to hear that. You carried enough that was never yours. Let this part go. Caleb closed his eyes, and the cabin seemed to breathe around him. For 3 years, he had lived inside one sentence he never said aloud. I should have done more. He had worn it while fixing fences, buying groceries, standing in church parking lots after Sunday service, smiling at neighbors who asked how he was doing. Atlas had slept outside his door every night because dogs know when silence becomes too heavy for a man to carry alone. Now Elias's voice, thin with distance but steady with mercy, reached across the years and took that sentence apart word by word. The tape neared its end. If Jonah finds you, help him remember me as I was. Not as a file, not as a mistake, as his brother. And if Atlas leads you there, trust him. God gives some messages hands, some voices, and some pause. The recorder clicked off. No one moved. Dust drifted in the sunlight. Jonah lowered himself onto the old chair and wept without sound, his shoulders folding under a grief that had finally found a room large enough to hold it. Caleb placed the recorder back inside the box, then opened the envelope. Inside was a folded map, 2 photographs, and a short letter. On the map, one spot was circled in blue ink, the county records office in Ashford, 28 miles away. Beside it, Elias had written, "The copy that matters is where nobody thought to look." Caleb looked at Jonah, then at Atlas. The dog stood and walked to the door, facing the trail back down the mountain. Caleb slipped the map into his jacket. His hands were still shaking, but his voice was calm when he finally spoke. Then we finish it right. They left the cabin with the metal box wrapped in Jonah's jacket and the old map folded inside Caleb's front pocket, close enough to his heart that every step reminded him why they were still walking. The morning had fully opened by then. Sunlight came through the pines in long gold shafts, touching the wet leaves, warming the fog until it lifted from the road like a curtain being drawn back. Atlas led them down the service trail with quiet certainty, stopping once at each carved mark as if honoring the path Elias had left behind. Jonah walked behind Caleb, carrying the recorder in both hands, not like evidence, but like something sacred. No one spoke until they reached the rail crossing. The world looked different there now. The rusted tracks no longer felt abandoned. They felt like a line between the life Caleb had been surviving and the one he had been asked to enter again. Caleb looked toward Pine Hollow Road, then toward Ashford, 28 miles away. My truck is at the house, he said. Jonah nodded. I can follow you. Atlas stepped between them and gave one quiet huff, impatient with human hesitation. For the first time that day, Caleb almost smiled. They returned to the house just after 8 o'clock. The porch still held the damp print of Jonah's earlier visit. Caleb noticed it, then noticed something else beside it. Atlas's paw marks circling the spot where the dog tag had been. A pattern of waiting. Inside, Caleb moved with purpose. He placed the photographs in a clean folder, tucked the second dog tag into a small cloth pouch, and set the cassette recorder in a padded lunch cooler so the old tape would not crack in the heat. Atlas watched from the kitchen doorway, his ears following every sound. Jonah stood near the sink, looking around the house without intruding on it. He saw the Marine Corps mug, the worn Bible on the side table, the framed flag folded in a triangle, and the unopened wooden box on the shelf. He did not ask. Caleb appreciated that. Some rooms inside a man were not unlocked by questions. 10 minutes later, they were on the road to Ashford, Atlas in the back seat, head between the front seats, eyes fixed ahead. The highway ran past soybean fields, gas stations, a church with a white steeple, and a water tower painted blue and peeling near the top. Ordinary America moved around them. A school bus stopped at a corner. A mail carrier waved at a farmer. A woman in a red pickup balanced coffee and a phone at a stoplight. Caleb saw all of it with a strange ache. While he had been trapped inside one unfinished day, the world had kept making breakfast, cutting grass, filling church pews, and driving children to school. The Ashford County Records Office sat inside a brick building across from the courthouse, small enough to be missed if you were not looking for it. The flag outside snapped gently in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of paper, lemon cleaner, and old carpet. A clerk with silver glasses looked up from her desk as they entered. Her eyes went first to Atlas. Caleb opened his mouth to explain, but the woman smiled softly. "Service dog?" she asked. Caleb looked at Atlas, then at the folder in his hand. In every way that matters. She allowed them through. They requested archived property transfers, emergency dispatch logs, and storage records from the year Elias disappeared. The clerk moved slowly at first, cautious in the way officials become when old pain arrives with paperwork. But when Jonah placed Elias's dog tag on the counter, her expression changed. Not pity, respect. She led them to a back room filled with filing cabinets and banker boxes labeled in black marker. The copy that mattered was where nobody thought to look. Caleb repeated the words silently. Atlas sniffed along the lower shelves, then stopped at a box marked surplus maintenance contracts. Caleb frowned. It made no sense. Jonah lifted the lid. Inside were yellowed invoices, road repair forms, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope taped beneath a cardboard divider. Caleb carefully peeled it free. Elias's handwriting stared back at him again. His hand steadied this time. He opened it and found a duplicate report, photographs, and a signed statement that had never reached the official file. Quiet filled the room. Not empty quiet. Holy quiet. Jonah pressed one hand to the cabinet to steady himself. Caleb read only enough to understand. Elias had not vanished into confusion. His final message had survived in plain sight, hidden among ordinary records because ordinary places are often where truth waits best. Atlas sat at Caleb's feet and leaned against his leg. Caleb lowered his hand to the dog's head. Years of shame did not disappear all at once. They loosened, like a knot finally touched by patient fingers. Outside the records room, the courthouse bell rang 9 times. Caleb looked at Jonah and held up the envelope. "He made it here," Caleb said softly. Jonah nodded, his eyes shining. "And so did you." By noon, the quiet room at the Ashford County Records Office no longer felt like a place of dust and forgotten folders. It felt like the center of a long-delayed sunrise. Caleb stood beneath the humming fluorescent light with Elias's hidden envelope in his hands, reading each page slowly, not because the words were hard to understand, but because every line gave shape to years of unanswered silence. Jonah sat at the small table across from him, the cassette recorder resting between them like a witness that had crossed time without losing its voice. Atlas lay at Caleb's feet, chin on his paws, eyes open, calm in the way only a dog can be calm when the humans finally begin to understand what he has known all along. The documents did not make the past painless. They did not bring back the sound of Elias laughing at bad coffee or calling every shortcut a scenic route. But they did something Caleb had not expected. They moved the weight. For years, that weight had sat on his chest as if grief had built a house there and locked the door from the inside. Now, with each page, each date, each careful note Elias had left behind, the door opened a little. Caleb saw the truth clearly. Elias had not been erased. He had left a trail. Not loud, not angry, not desperate. Faithful, like breadcrumbs through the dark, like marks on trees, like a dog tag placed on a porch at the hour when the world was quiet enough to listen. The county clerk returned with a plain cardboard archive box and a form for certified copies. She did not ask for details. Maybe she had learned, after decades of handling birth records, deeds, wills, and names written in fading ink, that paper often carried more tears than people admitted. She simply slid the form toward Caleb and said, "Take your time." Caleb nodded, but it was Jonah who picked up the pen first. His hand trembled when he wrote Elias Ward in the request line. Caleb watched the letters appear, no longer hidden inside memory, no longer trapped in the mouth of someone too hurt to speak. A name belonged in daylight. When the copies were made, they drove to the Veterans Affairs Outreach Office 2 blocks from the courthouse, a modest building with a small flag garden out front and a bench dedicated to local service members. Caleb expected questions, delay, maybe the careful language of people trained to move slowly around old records. Instead, an older counselor named Mr. Hanley listened without interrupting. He had white hair, a navy tie, and eyes that softened the moment Jonah placed the second dog tag on his desk. Caleb spoke only when he had to. Jonah filled in what he could. Atlas sat between them, steady and silent, one paw resting on Caleb's boot as if anchoring him there. Mr. Hanley read the first pages, then removed his glasses and looked toward the window. "This needs to be reviewed," he said. "Properly. No promise of miracles. No grand speech. Just one honest word placed where neglect had stood for too long. Properly." By late afternoon, Caleb and Jonah stood outside in the warm Tennessee light. Cars passed on Main Street. A boy rode by on a bicycle with a baseball glove hanging from the handlebars. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang once, soft and bright. Jonah held the certified copies against his chest. "I spent so many years thinking nobody wanted to know," he said. Caleb looked down at Atlas, whose silvered muzzle caught the sun. Sometimes the truth has to wait for the right witness. Jonah followed his gaze. Atlas lifted his head, as if the sentence belonged to him. Caleb reached into his pocket and took out Elias's first dog tag. The metal was warmer now from being carried all day. He placed it in Jonah's hand. Jonah tried to give it back, but Caleb closed his fingers around it. "He was your brother before he was my burden," Caleb said. Jonah's face tightened, then eased, like a man setting down a box he had carried since childhood. Atlas stepped forward and pressed his head against Jonah's leg. Jonah lowered one hand to the dog's neck and whispered, "Thank you for bringing him back." Atlas did not wag his tail. He simply leaned closer, accepting the words as if gratitude, too, was part of the mission. They drove back toward Pine Hollow Road as the sun lowered behind the Tennessee hills, turning the fields gold and the windshield amber. Jonah followed in his own car for the first few miles, then pulled beside Caleb at the last stoplight before the county road split. For a moment, neither man rolled down a window. They simply looked at each other through the glass, two lives joined by one name, one dog, and one truth that had waited too long. Then Jonah lifted Elias's dog tag from his chest, where he had placed it on its chain, and gave a small nod. Caleb returned it with one of his own. No salute, no grand goodbye, just recognition. The light changed. Jonah turned east toward town, and Caleb turned north toward home. Atlas watched Jonah's car disappear until it became a spark between the trees, then settled back with a soft sigh, as if one part of the mission had finally been released. By the time Caleb reached the house, evening had cooled the yard. The porch boards had dried. The strange footprint was gone. Only Atlas's paw marks remained faintly in the dust near the top step, little half-moons where the morning had begun. Caleb carried the archive box inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For a long while, he stood there with both hands resting on the lid. The house felt different, though nothing had moved. The same clock ticked over the sink. The same flag hung beside the door. The same wooden box sat unopened on the shelf. But the silence had changed. It no longer pressed against him. It gave him room. Caleb took the wooden box down and set it beside the archive folder. His fingers hesitated at the latch only once. Inside were photographs, patches, letters, and the small things a man keeps when he cannot keep the days themselves. He placed Elias's second dog tag inside, not on top like evidence, but among the memories where it belonged. Then he added the faded strip of green canvas, still marked by crooked stitching. Atlas came to his side and rested his chin on the edge of the table, watching every movement with solemn attention. Caleb smiled faintly. "You followed the bad sewing," he whispered. The dog's tail tapped the floor once. Outside, the first evening crickets began their song. Caleb took the cassette recorder from the padded cooler and placed it beside the box, not hidden, not locked away. Some voices are not meant to be buried after they have fought so hard to come home. Later, as twilight settled over Pine Hollow Road, Caleb sat on the front steps with Atlas beside him. The air smelled of cut grass, cedar, and distant rain. Fireflies blinked above the fence line. Down the old service road, the trees stood dark and still, but they no longer looked like a warning. They looked like witnesses who had finally spoken. Caleb laid one hand on Atlas's warm neck. He thought about Elias, about Jonah, about the clerk who had said take your time, and the counselor who had said properly. Small words, small acts. Yet sometimes mercy does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a tag on a porch, a paw at a locked gate, a name written where someone will one day find it. Atlas lifted his head toward the road, ears relaxed, eyes calm. Nothing was coming. Nothing needed to. Caleb looked into the fading light and breathed without flinching. The mission from the past had not come back to destroy him. It had come back to return what grief had taken. The truth, the brother, the dog's quiet faith, and the man Caleb Rose still was beneath the weight.